Hello, hello, friends. Good to see you. Good to be with you. Hi, Jeff.
Hello. Great to be here with you, Scott.
Excellent. Well, hey, friends, I'm Scott Shute. I'm founder of Changing Work. And we started these Changing Work live series because we want to highlight leaders that are out there helping to change work from the inside out. We believe that work can be an amazing place. It does not have to be a place that is whatever, not fun. So today I have with me super genius Jeff Jacobs. Jeff is a senior director of organizational effectiveness at Adobe. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. We need to set a much lower bar than starting off with super genius.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, well, that'll be for the audience to determine, but
We'll give you something to rise up and aspire to, right?
I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And if you're joining us live on LinkedIn, feel free to use the comments. It helps us, know that somebody's out there listening. Hey, Robert. Hey, Susie. Good to be with you. All right. Let's get rolling. Jeff, okay. Senior Director, Organizational Effective. That is a mouthful. Could
Yes.
you tell us what is organizational effectiveness?
What does this mean exactly?
Yes.
So the best way I can describe it is that I sit in the world in between centralized learning and development. So where most of us are familiar with centralized learning and development or talent development organizations, they look out across the organization over all the employees and how do we create development. And then we have our business partners that are assigned business units. I sit in between those folks, and I'm like an internal consultant that essentially pretty much 100% of what I do is a tailored engagement. So I work with intact leadership teams. I work with the business partners and the leaders to diagnose how are they doing, what's their effectiveness, and how do we improve it.
Cool. So if you think about it from a business perspective, I'm guessing that this role didn't exist, maybe doesn't even exist now in some companies, but for sure didn't exist 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So why does a business invest in something like this? Like, what is the business hoping to achieve?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. Not only did this role not exist in the past, it still does not exist at many companies. So I'm very fortunate to have this role at Adobe. It's the best role I've had in my 30 plus years in human resources. So the reason the role exists is to help organizations and leadership teams essentially get unstuck. So wherever you are in a model of team effectiveness, forming, storming, norming, if you like that particular model, wherever you are, sometimes bringing in those fresh eyes, those internal consultants that ask the questions, that figure out where things are. We help shine a light where people may not be able to see it. So that way, there's a huge benefit associated with that. And because we work with teams in these engagements and on ongoing strategies, we can scale to cover a fair number of people. I work with 200 leaders and their leadership teams. So there's a lot of impact we can have.
Cool. And I'm guessing we all have a sense of the themes that are going on at work, but what are the themes that you're seeing?
Yeah. Because of all the change that consistently exists inside and outside of organizations, a lot of my work is around change management. It's around leader and team integration work. Obviously, we're dealing with a lot of back to work activities and, all of that
Mm,
that goes along with it. I do a lot around communication and conflict resolution and
mm.
how do we align around norms of behavior and expectations. And then obviously aligning around strategic planning. A lot of what we get is that people still get confused about, okay, I understand the vision, but what does this mean to me? How do I operationalize it? What are you doing? What am I
Sure.
doing? So collaboration is a big theme as well.
Got it. Got it. All right. Well, so those are really interesting themes. So we have back to work. We have the company has a vision, but it's not all the way trickling down to alignment with all the employees. We have communications issues because leaders are people too, and sometimes they don't get this right. Sometimes they're amazing at it. Sometimes they don't get it right. Okay, so when this goes well, like
Yeah.
maybe you've seen, well, I'm sure that you've seen the differences between this when company culture or team environment goes well versus it's not going well. Like, what are the differences that you can point to before and after?
Yeah. It's for me, this is going to be a very potentially simplistic answer, but I sometimes measure this in the degree of passive aggressive behavior that we see within the workforce,
Huh.
because it has to do with the degree of authenticity, the degree of honesty that exists. One of the things that strikes me about Adobe is we have a value called "Be Genuine," and that's not
Mm.
unusual. A lot of companies would have that on their wall and such. But that authenticity makes a huge difference, and you can tell fairly quickly when you move into a new team the degree of authenticity that exists, the degree of trust that exists, and how
Mm.
much we invest in it. Now, Adobe is a company that has a lot of operational rigor. We focus on delivering for our customers, on execution, and it's hard to invest in these things that are perceived as, yes, important, but not urgent. So
Mm.
that degree of trust that we invest in, the safety that fosters innovation and risk taking, that can be very challenging for many organizations.
Oh, there's so much in that last thing. So you talk about safety, psychological safety. One of my favorite topics. You've probably seen the research from Google, Project Aristotle, 6, 7, 8
Mhm.
years ago.
Yep.
Psychological safety, number one factor in building a high performing team. But let's dig into it a little bit. What does it mean? Like, and what's the difference between someone who's not feeling that way and how they perform versus someone who does feel that level of psychological safety and how they perform?
Oh, absolutely. So there's a couple pieces in your question. So there is the difference in the performance, and then there's also how do we create that psychological safety, what comes into play there. So the difference is monumental. It has to do with a lot very personal example of that. So Sunday nights, how do you feel about the alarm
Mm,
clock going off the next morning? And that's a measure of
mm,
psychological safety. That's a measure
mm.
of your emotion, your enthusiasm to be at work. And when you are not feeling safe, you are not questioning the status quo. You are not volunteering ideas. You are not taking risks. You are
That's
just have your heads down. And likely you're not collaborating to the degree that you could be as well.
right.
And all of those things have exponential impact on our abilities. So that raises the question, so how do you then create psychological safety? There's a lot of
Exactly.
wonderful books out there. There's a lot of wonderful information out there, but I'll give you my 2 cents on the topic. For me, psychological safety starts with leadership modeling. So, for
Mm,
instance, I'll give you an example. Last year, we had an initiative, a culture of feedback initiative. We wanted to invest in a culture of feedback within the business unit I support. And with the focus on feedback, there's so much emphasis on how to give feedback and whatnot. My
mm.
singular focus on that was teaching leaders how to ask for feedback.
Ah,
Because by virtue of them asking for feedback, they are opening the door and modeling the behavior and modeling that vulnerability. So for me, psychological safety starts with you, Scott, as my leader. Are you vulnerable? Are you taking risks? Are you admitting mistakes? Are you asking me for feedback so we have an even playing field in our relationship? Or am I always the subordinate and are you always providing feedback to me? So
I
those are just a
love that.
couple of factors.
I love that. I've worked for some amazing people, and some of them never asked for feedback once, and
Yeah,
it just changes our view of them, right? But when
absolutely.
we do as a leader ask for feedback, we create this level of vulnerability. One of my favorite practices when giving performance reviews, because that's a very vulnerable time as an employee to receive it.
Of
If the
course.
manager can also ask, like, all right, let's turn the tables. Like, you tell me, how can I be a better leader for over the next 6 months or the next year?
Yeah. One of the things I think we forget is that our managers, every person we work with only sees one facet of our contributions. So to come forward with feedback, it's almost as though I am coming down with wisdom that cannot be questioned. But really, what I'm providing you is a data point for consideration. And you are the only one that has that full spectrum, which is why getting feedback from a number of different people is so critical.
Hmm. Cool. Okay. So that worth the price of admission. Leaders, if you want to build psychological safety, ask for feedback. How about another tip?
So the other thing that comes to mind when we talk about psychological safety is that there was an article that came out a few months ago about value and the
Hmm.
fact that individuals want to be not just valued for their contributions, but valued for who they are as human beings.
Hmm.
And in some cases, in many cases, our focus is almost entirely on what have you contributed, as
Hmm.
opposed to what we have seen within, especially these last 3 years, the rise in empathy, the rise in wellness, the rise in even disclosure of needs. It used to be that if we were on a video chat and the phone rang or the gardener was here or the dog barked, I'd be humiliated. But now we got kids sitting on our laps and we got all this going on. So it's really the degree to which we accept that someone has that 360 degrees within their life. One
Yeah.
concerning article I saw just this past week was about the concept that we're seeing now an immediate 180 in terms of a lot of the empathetic work practices that are existing, especially in Silicon Valley, as we're turning around and seeing a lot of the layoffs. Not only the
Hmm.
layoffs, but the manner in which the layoffs are being conducted is very
Hmm.
concerning. So making me feel valued as an individual should not be a difficult thing, but it's also very personal and is a one-by-one situation as opposed to something that scales consistently in the same way across an organization.
Sure. So if you were brought in to help a leader get better at
Mhm.
this idea of helping to see people or have people feel seen, what
Yeah.
would you advise them?
Yeah.
How do they do that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's a double-edged sword because one of the things we did during COVID is to combat video fatigue. We used to shorten meetings,
Yeah.
but at the same time, what we're also trying to do is encourage people to add more personal connection in these meetings. So
Mm.
not just jumping into the agenda, but asking people, checking in, how are you doing, asking those follow-up questions, making sure it's sincere
Yeah.
and such. So I think there's certainly that aspect to it. But I think the simple nature is that if I'm in a one-on-one with you and I go back, I don't mean to be redundant, but it's how much I believe in this point. If I'm in a one-on-one with you and I ask you, tell me, what observations do you have for me over these past 2 weeks? What feedback do you have for me over these
Yeah.
past 2 weeks?
Yeah.
And I'm an individual contributor today. When I had a team, I would frequently end one-on-ones by saying, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your engagement today? And whatever they told me, then I would say, okay, then how do we move it from wherever it is to a 10?
Yeah.
And that's a 2-minute conversation, but it says something about how I value them and what can we do about their situation.
That's right. That's right. I love that. I like that because sometimes we ask, how are you doing? And we get back good, and we
Yeah.
just leave it alone, right?
Yeah.
But instead, if we go further, like, okay, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not to be pushy, but it's just like, oh, I care. I'm trying to figure out how.
And it
You know?
doesn't take that much time to do these things.
That's right. That's right. Robert has a question, and friends, I have more questions for Jeff, but I'd love to hear from you in the chat. So if you have questions, go ahead and throw them in there. Robert asks, he says, I agree that's rare that leaders rarely ask for feedback. Why is that?
Hmm. Yeah. I have definitely a point of view on that. And, it goes back, we had one of our very large scale Adobe events, our summit event last year. One of our guests was John Donahoe, the CEO of Nike, and he sat down for a coffee chat with our CEO, Shantanu Narayan. And at the end of that coffee chat, Shantanu asked him, so what would you say are your top leadership qualities that you think are most important? And I not only loved John's response, but I've also transcribed it and I use it in a number of my different workshops and sessions with folks. And he says the two qualities that he prizes above all others are authenticity and vulnerability. Now,
Hmm.
authenticity is pretty straightforward. We talk about being genuine and sincere and whatnot, because that's the kind of environment we want. On the vulnerability front, he says, because vulnerability creates connection and connection creates followership. So
Hmm.
why don't people do that? And I was trying to find the study prior to our conversation because it was top of mind for me, but I couldn't track it down. But there was a recent study within the last 6 months or so that indicated that a significant percentage, upwards of 70% of executives, feel as though if they modeled more empathy or vulnerability, they would lose credibility with their followers.
Hmm.
And I think this concept that I believe so strongly in is that there is strength in vulnerability. There is
Yes.
strength in modeling weakness,
Yes.
because the only way that we can grow and develop and improve is if we admit we have room to grow and develop and improve. And if
Yes.
we're not doing that, then we're sending that message to our employees that we expect them to not make any mistakes and be perfect.
Right.
One of the things that I've seen us struggle with at Adobe is with the definition of the word pilot, because pilot is supposed to be a minimum viable product that you put out there and you iterate on. And sometimes with our attention to detail and our perfectionism, a pilot is just the first perfect attempt at something. So we want to make sure that we're allowing space for risk taking.
Absolutely. I read a really interesting thing the other day about the exact best percentage of failure in terms of learning. This
Mhm.
was in the context of these scientists were trying to train AI to be smarter.
Yeah.
And it turns out that failure was actually required for AI to learn more. And
Mhm.
in this science, it was something like 16%.
Mhm.
The appropriate amount of failure was about 16%, or 1 in 6 times.
Mhm.
Now think about that in our own lives. Like if everything went perfect all the time, we're not really learning a whole lot.
Yeah.
Or if it went wrong 5 out of 6 times, then we're not feeling very great and probably not trying new things. But if we all got a hold of this, hey, 1 in 6 is a great amount of failure, and celebrated not the failure itself, but what we're learning out of that,
Yes.
how amazing would that be?
And operationalizing those learning sessions. Very true. I've been very fortunate, to work for some great companies, Adobe being one of them. And a prior company I worked with used to regularly do product reviews in which we would celebrate the lessons learned from failures. And to make that part of your culture is huge. And what is the story you're telling your employees when you make that part of your operating mechanisms?
Beautiful. Human has a question here. Said, refreshing to see how this is how this is working at Adobe, where the leaders value what Jeff has to offer. What strategies do you recommend to employees at companies where the level of awareness may not be present within management?
Boy, we could spend several hours on that question, Human. So I appreciate that. So first off, when I coach an individual, I have to recognize that sometimes you have to be really honest with yourself as to whether the culture of the company you work at is a fit for you and whether or not you're going to be successful there. Because there are companies that say, for instance, we want change agents. We want people to come in and break glass. And then as soon as you start breaking glass, all people look around and say, oh, wait a minute, this person doesn't collaborate well. They don't get along with others.
Yeah,
So that's my first message is you have to kind of do your own assessment as to whether there is receptivity to this culture change. The second thing is that you have to consider how you are approaching it because your approach needs to be very much in terms of projected solutions, not complaining about the status quo, because you have to be cautious about how you manage your own brand in the situation. And I
Mm,
think that's part of the challenge that a lot of us face. And I know I've received that feedback before of, hey, Jeff, you got to be careful. Don't be so negative. Don't, be the. So I have to take that extra step of not only identifying, okay, what's not working optimally now? And then what suggestions do I have to make a difference here? And who's in a position to make those changes? So maybe it's a leader, maybe it's a business partner, maybe it's colleagues on the team, whatever
mhm.
it may be. But it's really a case by case situation. But those are a couple of initial
Sure.
reactions.
Maybe thinking about it another way, if there's folks on the call that are interested in convincing, we'll use this
Hmm.
word, convincing their internal leadership that this type of work is important.
Hmm.
If you were to speak to a group of whatever C-level folks about ROI of this type of work, what tact would you take or what direction would you head there?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and I would answer with an example. A
Mm,
lot of the work I do is because of all the change that exists within our fast moving businesses. We have a lot of leadership changes, and with those leadership changes come stylistic changes.
mm,
And whether I was working for a hard charging, tough, candid individual, or I worked with the caring individual, and what's the impact to the bottom line and into the revenue that we're dealing with, helping accelerate through those stages of change to high performing, we don't have a lot of time. We operate in bite-size monthly, quarterly timeframes. So the faster we can accelerate, the better off we are. And every time we experience a change in a customer, in a deliverable, in a leader, we go back to the beginning of that forming process. And it's only the infrastructure that we have put in place that enables us to speed our acceleration. So if we don't invest in these things that are 100% important, not urgent, then we are going to be constantly hitting up against the same walls over and over again.
Yeah.
So when I think about ROI, I think I have seen directly how effective some teams are. And I can tell because I work with them less. So over time, we will put in a concerted period, concerted effort. And then over time, they get their momentum, and we are leaders creating leaders, because then the leaders become change agents in of themselves when they understand the questions to ask and the process to go through.
Beautiful. I read a couple stats. The first one I think everybody knows is that our relationship with work, the single biggest factor in our relationship with work is the relationship that we have with our manager.
Of course, yeah.
Which makes sense. But here's the thing I didn't know. That relationship with work is the second biggest factor in our overall life satisfaction, second only to our mental well-being.
Yeah.
Which means that the impact that our relationship with our manager has on our overall happiness is extraordinary.
Absolutely.
So to me, when we think about, hey, here's how we can change the world, making managers, up-leveling managers' level of compassion and empathy and quality is one of those places.
We just rolled out what we're calling the Adobe Leader Experience, which is a mandatory training for all of our people managers. And on a quarterly basis, we change the content. And one of the statistics that we shared is that managers have upwards of 80% impact on my engagement on any given moment.
Wow,
so
80%.
80%, when you think about that kind of impact, then you really have to be incredibly serious about your role as a manager.
Yeah.
You may be a subject matter expert, but you have to now change how you work as a manager in devoting time to that. I've seen vice presidents who struggle to scale to be senior vice presidents because so at every level, at every milestone, we have new lessons to learn. And I think the challenge is when I've achieved a level of success and I have that big title and I have those stock options and whatever it might be, is it getting harder to hear the feedback?
Yeah.
One of the things when I was working with our ops staff, one of the observations I made is you all may think you're approachable, but your titles keep people from essentially holding up a mirror and sharing with you their observations. So you have to work that much harder to convince them that you are serious and there will not be repercussions for people speaking their mind.
Well, it's such a great point. It happens because of the title, but also happens internally because that leader, everything about their promotion and their path has led them to believe that I'm right. I am doing this right. And the company has provided. So that is a good point. It goes back to our thing about vulnerability.
And let's not forget that we have back-to-back 25 or 30-minute meetings all day. So it's not like we have a lot of free time to provide each other feedback, especially on video. So it's not a hallway conversation. It's a formal, how can I get time on your schedule? And maybe 3 weeks from now, I can give you real-time feedback on that exchange we had in this morning's meeting.
For sure. Friends, we have about 5 minutes left in our discussion today. If you have questions for Jeff or myself, please put them in the chat. Jeff, one of the things that I'm really cognizant of now, in this moment, there seems to be many companies who are cutting budgets, they're cutting staff. I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of the level of funding for the work that you do or people development in general.
Yeah. I'm very fortunate. Of my 30 years in HR, 20 have been in high tech, and most of those 20 have been with two companies in particular that I would prize above all others. And I think it's those companies that want to invest in what is important and not just the deliverable in a short-term in a short-term manner. So, for instance, in our last all hands, our CEO put up his hand and said, "We're not going to have any layoffs."
Hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't going to reallocate seats here and there. I mean, we've got 28,000 employees, so we're going to move people around and whatnot, but no 10% across the board, nothing like we've seen in those situations.
Hmm.
So I think the companies that really distinguish themselves are the
Hmm.
ones that understand that they have to be very cautious. Now, in a case like Adobe, we have been managing headcount very diligently all along so that we haven't gotten ourselves into a problem. So it's that combination of operational rigor and philosophy. It's the head and the heart about how we
Hmm.
approach this.
Hmm. Beautiful. Robert asks if retention of talent is a metric that you measure closely at Adobe.
Absolutely. We measure retention of talent as it relates to level, as it relates to their tenure with the organization. So are we seeing people at 1 to 2 years leave at a different clip than those 3 to 5 years? We look at it based on region. We looked at it based on business unit. We absolutely look at that.
Cool. And going back to ROI, I'm sure it's probably obvious to most of the people on the call, but why does it matter? Why does retention matter?
Oh, why does retention matter?
Yeah.
Oh, retention matters because, first of all, when someone leaves a company, there is something contagious about that. So it's not just one person that's leaving, it's one person who leaves, and the grass is always greener, and people are attracted to other opportunities. Then, of course, we have the cost of having to cover for that person while we backfill. Then there is the time associated with the backfill. Then there is the training and the upswing of that individual. And then remember what I said about forming, storming, and norming, and the fact that every time a new person comes on, you're reestablishing that team effectiveness. So how do you accelerate that process? So the dysfunction that exists every time one human being leaves our organization is profound. If you just think
Amazing.
about, to get your job done, how many people do you interact with? And every one of those people has to get used to someone new when your seat is backfilled, even though it may take many months to backfill that seat.
Right. Statistics bear this out. It's something like it's a range depending on level and organization, but something the cost to the organization is something somewhere between one half to twice that person's salary on an annual basis. So if somebody's making whatever $150,000, it could be a $300,000 cost to your company, and that's just the hard cost, not to mention all the emotional costs that you mentioned.
There's another piece of this as well, and that is when you have individuals who, and I hate to bring this point up, but when you have individuals who are not contributing to the degree they should, and the importance of finding an opportunity for them to be more successful, either within your company or helping them make a graceful exit so that you can replace them with a higher performer. We shy away from a lot of those conversations, not just at Adobe, but that's just human nature. So that's a big piece of the equation as well.
For sure. Yeah, I think part of compassionate leadership is also being able to make the hard decisions to take care of those underperformers for the rest of the team, for the whole, and even for that person themselves. If the role is not working out, help them either coach them up or find them another role.
I'm a big fan of Kim Scott's work around radical candor, and one of the bits of research that I heard associated with that work is that you would think that conventional wisdom would tell you that your biggest fear is being criticized, is being given negative feedback, and
Mm,
yet the research that I've heard is your biggest fear is you won't be told the truth, and
mm,
that people will make judgments and they will put you in a box and they will label you, but not give you the benefit of the feedback so that you can change perceptions, you can help develop and grow and become a different person at different stages in your career. Especially challenging if you stay in one place for a long time, then changing your brand is a real hard thing to do. And you rely on that feedback. So that importance of, please tell me the truth.
beautiful. I think that's a good place to leave it. You have told us the truth today, Jeff. I appreciate you. I appreciate your commitment to this work. I appreciate all the folks who have joined us today. So thank you. There are a lot of good nuggets in there. And friends, join us next time for the Changing Work Live series. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott.
And everybody, we'll see you next time. Go out there and be an ambassador for compassion. The world needs more of it. Take care. Work does not have to be a place that causes pain. Work, when done right, can actually be something that helps us heal. Hi, I'm Scott Shute. In my career, I've had the opportunity to be on some incredible teams in amazing organizations. At LinkedIn, I led a customer operations team of over 1,000 people. And I've spent the last 30 years as a student of the game, learning what makes great teams thrive. And my mission is to change work from the inside out. But first, let's talk about teams. Have you ever worked on an amazing team? One that was inspired towards a common vision? One where you felt connected, where there was a level of trust? It's incredibly powerful. And sadly, many people don't work on teams like that. And the statistics bear this out. Only 20% of workers are highly engaged. 9 out of 10 say that they would work for less money to have more meaning in their work. And over half, 55%, say that they are going to look for a new job in the next 12 months. Now, companies know that they need to build amazing cultures. It's a business critical outcome now, not a nice to have. In fact, company culture is 12 times more important than compensation in determining whether somebody stays or leaves. And managers know they need to create amazing teams, but they don't often know exactly what to do or what works in this new hybrid environment. With Changing Work, we're curating the best practices from amazing organizations around the world, and we're making them accessible to everyone. So come join us on the journey to change work from the inside out.